Hey Mark, how are you?
I'm doing okay. Wrapping up my evening here with a nice cup of tea. How about you?
Morning with a nice cup of coffee. So,
Mm,
cheers.
cheers.
How was your weekend? What have you been thinking about and working on?
Weekend was good. Um, Mostly peace finance and peace capital and capital design and positive capital design over the weekend. Um, and this morning, Anik and I did some work revisiting peace engineering. Um, Particularly some of the distinctions between engineering and science. One of the differences, one of my um, favorite visionary thinkers, K. Eric Drexler, who sort of was the grandfather of nanotechnology,
Mhm.
makes this beautiful distinction between science and engineering, how science is an object of inquiry. Um, the whole process, the whole information flow is, observation, inquiry, trying to understand what's happening,
Mhm.
understand the phenomena, et cetera, and how the information flow in engineering actually goes the other direction. That you, if at the end of the day you haven't actually built something, you haven't engineered yet. No matter how much you understand the phenomena,
Right,
if you haven't
right.
actually built something that works, you're not
Mhm.
done yet as far as engineering goes. And so
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting distinction for our work, for
Well,
as we straddle sort of both peace sciences and peace engineering.
right. I mean, my degree is in engineering, and I describe engineering school. It's kind of like it's like Marine boot camp. If you can get through engineering school, you can get through anything. You can teach yourself anything. Uh, and I remember the first not quite the first decade of my professional career, it was in engineering. And I worked for a material science company that was called Raychem. It doesn't exist anymore. But at the time, it was this very significant company in the Bay Area, and it did material science. And the two founders were innovators around radiation chemistry, of all things, and coming up with materials that were based in this radiation chemistry process. And I worked in the aerospace division, and so we made connectors. And I was there at the cusp of one type of engineering into a new type in terms of processes. So it was in the days where we had draftsmen with the big tables, pencils, electric erasers, triangles, straight edges,
The
and
big T square on a on
the big
a
T
on a
square, the whole thing, right? And
yeah.
blueprints were done on vellum with pencil.
Yeah.
And you had these draftsmen, that's what they did all day, was they would design blueprints. And of course, my summer jobs, I had a summer internship with a large construction company, Dillingham Construction. And I was working with them at the time when they were working on an expansion of Stanford Hospital to do cardiology operating rooms. And the construction on that, the experience of just being the summer secretary, basically. I was working on an Apple computer at the time in this trailer, and the documentation and coordination that was required for that kind of civil engineering construction, where you had to have engineering control notices on any changes that you made, because you would have your blueprint of as designed, right? So here's the design, and you have it all in these blueprints, and of course different size A to E size paper and so on. And then you would have to go back and you would have to do the as built,
Mm-hmm.
because just because you designed
Redocument
it one way, what
what
actually
actually did.
happened, what happened in reality, right? Because
Yeah.
in design, because this is before you had 3D computer aided design. And so you have, especially with a building, engineering construction of a building, you have the walls, you have the wiring, you have the plumbing, you have the HVAC, you have the lighting, you have all these things going on, and they're all a different level of the blueprint. So you might have, okay, here's my foundation, and then you might have another level. I overlay the wiring, I overlay the plumbing. I overlay the, where are the windows going to be placed? Where are the doors, the physical objects? Oops, I had my HVAC, and that person is just designing that level, that thin slice of the building, but that duct is going into, how does that coordinate with the wall, or there's a window there? Like, did you really want the duct going through a window? And all this was done on paper. When I worked at Raychem, we were still doing things on paper, and I led the transition, the digital transformation from paper-based blueprints to computer-aided design. And that was a big mental paradigm for all the draftspeople, because it would take them maybe a day to 4 days to finish a blueprint, and we got that down to 4 hours.
Yeah.
So it was a big, big change. But even in that process, it was like, okay, so now we've taken that and we've made it more efficient and automated because we've digitized it. But then there were all these other things, and you had to still have the revision control of those documents. Because in the old days, you would have the vellum, there was a document control office, and there was a guy, and that was his job.
Essentially a project librarian.
It was like a project librarian, exactly. He was a librarian for the blueprints. You would sign it out, and there was a block on the blueprint where you would initial, and you would make the change, right? You would put the date in,
Wow.
and this is the revision, and it would be on the document itself, and there would be a block on it. And he would keep track of that and say, okay, you're checking out that blueprint. That means no one else can make a change to it, because it was the one physical document. It was the one artifact of the blueprint. There weren't multiple copies of it. Yep. And so if you went to the drawer and it was missing, and there would be imagine like a card catalog. It's like, yeah, Bill has it.
A placeholder saying, yeah.
Right, yeah, Bill's working on it, and he's, it'll be back in the drawer. But that, to me, engineering was very, very structured. And with engineering, there were artifacts every step of the way. And the computing that we had for engineering, for manufacturing, was on a mainframe. Mm-hmm. And I'm trying to remember what the name of the system was. I can't even remember now. It was really archaic. Well, it was the early 80s mainframe computing.
Basic 4, Fortran.
Whatever the program was, the only computing that we did in the organization was for manufacturing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was naming languages, but yeah, there weren't that many languages, and there weren't that many programs.
And so the only thing that computer system, that mainframe system, did was maintain a bill of materials. Now, a bill of materials is basically, I have my blueprint, I'm going to make this object. The bill of materials says there's this yellow lanyard, there's this white piece that's injected molded.
And then there's a hinge with a clear plastic.
There's a hinge, and then there's the label, right? And so you put all those things together, and then you would have assembly drawing that would tell you how to put it together. And so when you were doing the bill of materials, that would help you do the cost, right? So like, how much is this lanyard? This lanyard is 2 cents. The clear lid is 4 cents. The bottom lid is 5 cents. These component connectors, there's 3 of them. It's made of plastic and metal. Okay, right. Et cetera, et cetera. And so engineering is very granular. Yep. Because when you build something, you actually have to have a spec. And I did a tour of duty writing mil specs, military specifications. And that would be the document that this would need to comply with, and say, this object needs to be able to withstand this altitude, this pressure. It's going to be in an aircraft. It needs to be able to manage this level of vibration.
Here's how we handle this kind of quality control. We have to check for this and this.
Right.
Yeah.
And so,
it has to
engineering,
be within these tolerances. It has to, yeah.
Exactly. Tolerances was a big thing. And so certainly the first 5 years of my professional career was immersed in precision.
Yeah.
When we say we're going to build something, what exactly do you mean when you say we're going to build something?
Yeah.
And this wasn't behavioral, but this was definitely about nailing down the size, the heft. Is this, in order to make this plastic, I need to make a mold, right? And there's a cost to the mold, and so I want to make sure I get that right.
Right.
And so on.
And it goes right up, like the stuff from your bill of materials goes right up into your supply chain in terms of, okay, that mold, if you're only doing 1,000 pressings in that mold, then you only have to buy this one, and then the cost is only this. But if you're planning to do 100,000,
Right.
then you'll need to do either 10 of those or one of the expensive ones, and that will change your cost per unit. And yeah, all of these things are factored in and
Right.
have
And
to be tracked.
right. And so when we think about like the economics of making things, it gets to be really, really precise because you know exactly how much each component costs, and you know how to reduce the cost at scale, and that matters, right? It's very, very precise. Even with like
Not
the
only,
iPhone,
yeah,
that they removed the
yeah,
phone jack, and everyone's going like, "Oh my God, they removed the phone jack." I go, "But yes, but from a manufacturing standpoint, I get why they removed the phone jack, because they have these tight tolerances to fit stuff into this real estate. By removing that connector, it made incremental more room for the battery, for the other things that made a difference in the performance. They go, that's the trade-off. And now I don't have to pay for that connector, that jack, and multiply that by 10 million phones.
yeah.
That ends up being real money, right? So there's engineering is also about scale. It's precision, it's about scale, it's about the
It's
cost
not
of
only,
tiny things.
you not only need to know what component you need and what the cost of that component is, you need to know, can I get it into my supply chain at this time, or do I need that alternate one that I can get at this time, because otherwise it delays my whole project. And yeah, there's,
Right.
yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, and back then we didn't have just in time quite yet, because we didn't have
It requires
the
massive
online
computation to
systems.
do just in time. Exactly.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Although it's interesting, so I ordered a MacBook Pro 16. It's like, this is going to be like such a mother computer. It's so good. It's going to be so awesome. But I got the notification from Apple that it's on its way, and I could track it. And I go, oh, I wonder, it's going to arrive on the 17th. It's coming from Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming straight from the factory in Shanghai. I was like, oh, but now, it's come such a long way, because now there are different, again, these data points, so I can track where that object is. It's in the factory. It's going through customs. It's getting the paperwork, and now it's going to, it's going to get on the ship, or I don't know how they're going to bring it over, ship or plane or whatever, and so on and so forth.
From a Peace technology perspective, there's a sensor that is detecting a behavior at each of those points. Hey, this package for this person just arrived here, and then that sensor is doing transmitting data across comms to computation, which is then pushing an actuator saying, send a message to Margarita that her package has now cleared customs, et cetera, et cetera. So,
right.
yeah.
And back in the 80s, when I was working on this was aspirational. We wanted to get to that point. Like, how do you track something? We didn't even have the little hand scanners and barcodes. That was pretty early on in a meaningful way, right?
Right. And it was so expensive in those days that people forget that both the communications networking and the computation to just do sense making on that was still massively expensive in those days. And so there's we've come such a long way, and the things that are now incredibly cheap and everybody takes for granted because they're so cheap, they used to be the big obstacle. So,
right. So it limited what you could coordinate on, or rather the way we coordinated as an engineering team. You had and you still do, you have these specialized functions. And again, because I came from like manufacturing tangible stuff, because software wasn't really a thing yet, that people, there weren't really software developers, because it was all mainframe computing, it was COBOL, it was Fortran. It was not a large community of people who programmed actually. So there wasn't anything about Agile or anything else. So even just all the planning that came from software, you can see the historical roots from engineering, where it's expensive, because if you get this injection mold wrong and it costs you $20,000 to make an injection mold, and you screwed up, or however much it cost back then,
you not only delay your production massively, you also incur this huge cost. And exactly.
Right. And so the thing that so we did plan a lot, because we could design it and prototype it and iterate it and say, okay, is that right? Yes. Let me get the mold right. Now that I got it right, I can scale it. Because it's so expensive to do, your time is cheap,
Exactly.
right? You
Exactly.
know, so you invest the time to get this
Time
right,
is cheaper than the, exactly. Yeah.
right? Um,
And that equation
now,
has flipped in today's
and it
world.
has flipped because now you have 3D printing, you have all these technologies now that, and you can do short runs. You can do a small run of something as opposed to saying, oh, in order, if I'm going to make this at all, it only works at a certain economy of scale, and anything below
Yeah.
that, I can't manufacture it at a point that it's affordable to people.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Economies of
and
scale
so,
didn't make sense
yeah.
when they, yeah.
But one of the things that we didn't think about in engineering, certainly in my engineering training, because I was a petroleum engineer, and a petroleum engineer is all about the economics of oil, really.
Yeah.
That's what it really comes down to is it affordable to extract the oil out of the ground? When is it affordable to extract it? How do you do it? How do you extract it in the cheapest way possible once the you know the you know basically the selling price of the barrels of oil, what is the price for that? What does it cost? When it gets over that threshold, I can start pumping oil, or I can start drilling for oil, because drilling for oil is actually a very risky business. There's a high failure rate because you can't actually see what's underground. We have these tools. You know, you can drill a well. You have to drill a well, though. You have to have the expense to drill the well. You drop these tools down, and then you do different analysis to see if there's any oil there. And potentially, you know, you calculate, you model the size of the reservoir and so on, but it's all a gamble. It's very high risk. Engineering is very driven by economics,
Yeah.
right? The numbers have to work out, and at least with my engineering curriculum, a ton of time was spent on the return on investment on anything that you would do, because engineering something is a pretty formidable venture. You know, you got to line up all these people, and again, from blueprinting to manufacturing to, you know, the bill of materials to getting it out the door. But the thing that we didn't really think about was environmental aspects. We never studied the environmental consequences or environmental degradation due to drilling oil. It wasn't in the curriculum at all. It wasn't even a point of conversation back then.
You and I grew up in a world where the world still felt really big, and we humans still felt really small in this really big world. And so it felt like, you know, there was infinite amounts of space and reality and ocean and land and all these things. And what possible impact could a tiny little human really have on that? You know, that sensibility was not heavily built in yet.
I mean, there were people in other silos, certainly talking about in the environment and so on, but they didn't talk to these
Yeah.
other silos. There wasn't any connection between the two.
And the sensibility hadn't pervaded the culture yet.
No.
You know, the people who were beginning to go, wait a second, I think that degradation might be caused by people. That, you know, that was a kind of a first time in history thing where people were doing things at a big enough scale that.
Yeah, but the environmental movement had been going on for at least a decade, if not for two. But there hadn't any connection to industry. Although, you know, we there was some awareness. We had courses on renewables and solar energy and so on back then. We had a professor at Stanford who was very much an advocate for solar energy, and everyone said like, oh yeah, poo-poo, but that's going to happen decades from now. Well, of course now it's 2020 and the time is
now
right.
It is decades from now.
It is from now. Gil Masters was doing that work.
Also, a bunch of that was motivated by economics rather than by environmental stuff. It's like the potential long-term source of this is cheaper in the long run when you can do it at scale and so on. It wasn't so much this will be cleaner or greener. It was much more just, some of it was it's just going to be greener in the dollar sense.
I disagree because I was there.
So
I mean, in terms of how but in terms of how I experienced it in the program and what we were looking at, because we did look at alternative energy sources. We were looking at a scenario of peak oil.
Right.
We weren't, but what we weren't doing is we weren't having a conversation about climate change. That was not on the table. It was more like, oh, this is renewable because it would be better for the environment. It wasn't about, we need to do this to avoid an existential threat. So in my engineering education, we weren't thinking about existential threats or planetary
Yeah.
threats that were real to
Yeah.
people. And so what I think is intriguing is that now, you and I are part of a small community of engineering professors from different schools who are looking at reimagining engineering. And our working title is Peace Engineering, to think about how engineers need to think about the social, environmental, political, economic consequences of the things they develop, right? Because it operates in a social construct. It operates in an environmental construct. And what does it mean when we put this out there? And if we don't think about it, how do we unconsciously perpetuate negative externalities, bias, especially now in the global conversation that we've had in the last few weeks around systemic racism, and being able to examine that more critically and say, like, again, it's neuroscience. Our reticular activation system has now been focused on what does racism look like, and it's not just the overt racism, but implicit racism in systems. And as engineers, what responsibility do we have to address that? And how do we design systems in the future that actually operate in a way that creates a more just society?
And that you can measure that it's really actually working. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
As opposed to, oh, someone will figure that out later. And certainly in Silicon Valley, we tend to have that mindset of maybe a policy or ethicist or someone will worry about it later. But first we have to get it running, and first we have to make a lot of money. We get the business model, we make a ton of money, and then maybe as an afterthought, we'll think about the ethical consequences of AI, autonomous vehicles, all these
And then
things.
meanwhile, the policymakers are vulnerable to, oh, well, that sounds like a really compelling narrative. So yeah, let's do that policy, as opposed to having any sort of systematic analytical way of measuring that code that you're about to write. Is it actually quality code?
Right. And the problem with policymakers is that, I mean, it's a full-time job to keep up with the innovative trends if you're in the field, right? Much less if you have another job, I mean, another responsibility, and then you have to keep up with how machine learning is changing, very, very rapidly. That can feel overwhelming. So one of the challenges that we have at a societal level is how do we increase technological and innovation literacy among other stakeholders, so that way they can come into the conversation and have be seen as a peer. Because let me tell you, in the engineering community, engineers can be, and scientists as well, can be arrogant and condescending to non-technical people. It's like, oh, well, you can't do the math and I can do the math, so therefore, I'm better than you. And so there's that arrogance and that blind spot that while these numbers may be this way, that's not the whole story.
There's a sort of known issues in both engineering and science of, since we worked so hard to figure out the models and the processes and the issues, where now we understand this aspect of this phenomena, since we worked so hard for that knowledge, that's the thing we're going to measure, because now we know how to measure that, and in the process, sometimes losing track of, it's wonderful that we can now measure something we couldn't measure before, but that's still not the whole phenomena. That's one aspect of it, and measuring just one piece of
and just because we can do something doesn't mean that we should do something. Yeah. Humans are expected to have judgment about what's appropriate. Is this really, just because I can do that, is that a really good idea? Is that wise? I don't know that in engineering education that we ask ourselves enough, but would this be wise? We tend to be amoral. It's like, well, people can use it for good or bad. It's like, yes, I know. But there's the upside of innovation, but what's the risk? If it goes wrong, can it go really wrong? In which case, whatever upside you have isn't worth it, or can you control that in some way? right? What are the safeguards that you can put in so that way you can really get the benefits? And how do we have those conversations that have as much weight as doing a classic engineering economic analysis of what the ROI is on your project?
And
How do
I mean,
we begin to measure the risk?
there are people whose entire career is built on doing that kind of calculation, but they are often not even known, let alone invited to the table.
Right.
But it's not like there's no expertise there. And they are more often people coming out of my world. They're often financial analysts who are trying to figure out the downside risk of a project. You know,
Mm-hmm.
okay, your pension fund is going to commit a lot of money here to this, you know, huge transnational power generation project with, you know, 5 dams and 3 hydroelectric facilities and whatever. What's the possible downside? But they're often not invited to the table for things that are more industry based rather than project based, you know, where it's like one investment, and if we screw up this investment, somebody will lose their job, versus here's this whole developing sector.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you get the right people at the table going, hang on a second, how are you structuring your downside risk and your tailing risk and so on? That level of conversation often doesn't happen at the industry level the way it does at a project level. You know, so.
Yeah, I do find that as engineers we're disadvantaged because we don't, our curriculum is so full with engineering electives that we don't have the luxury of time to get schooled in history or philosophy or the arts or other topics that could help us get a view and a lens to other parts of life, right? Because we have such blinders because the curriculum is so rigorous to make sure, you know, to learn how to do things technically correct, that we don't learn to understand if it's socially correct or emotionally correct, you know? And so again, we put these things out there and then they wreak havoc because we don't understand what happens when humans interact with the systems.
Our models of complex adaptive systems, societies and economies and ecosystems, and how each being incredibly complex in its own right, and then how all 3 of them, for example, interact with each other. Our ability to model those things still generally sucks, actually.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
And it's you know, thousands of times better than it was even a decade ago, and it still sucks. You know, so
You know, engineering goes back, you know, 2,000 years, 3,000 years. Human computation and social systems being able to measure it's like right here at the end of the yardstick, right? So there's a lot of catch up to do, but I think there's a unique opportunity right now as we have this convergence and we have this awareness now of what the impacts are. Certainly, you know, many people, many researchers, many commentators have looked at the unintended negative consequences of Twitter and Facebook and how they can be weaponized and used for disinformation, misinformation campaigns, psychological operations, disruptions of elections, increased polarization in societies that is triggered and catalyzed by outside actors. And I'm sure the founders did not intend that or envision that at all. So now that we're aware of this phenomenon and there are researchers who are documenting how the mechanics of how that works, how do we take that knowledge behind the paywall of peer-reviewed journals and make that accessible to young engineers and innovators? So that way they go, oh, okay, I need to be trained in this. So that way, whatever I design, I'm aware. And then I have systems in place to measure if I'm unintentionally getting that outcome. And I think that's at the heart of peace engineering and certainly of peace innovation, is to be able to put those early warning systems in place to see if you have harms, in addition to, are you getting the positive outcome that you want? So as opposed to saying, I'm going to throw technology out there that is amoral, that is neutral. It isn't moving in one direction or the other, to intentionally game it, or to tilt it and say, no, I'm actually doing it for this positive intent.
I mean, the basis of everything we're doing, because we're building on the ability to actually measure the phenomena we care about, measure it in high resolution, measure it in real time, that gives us the advantage of, and let's just talk about that aspect of peace engineering for a moment. This is where it's different than peace sciences, for example. We're not just trying to understand a phenomena. We're trying to be able to measurably make a difference on a phenomena. And that means, first of all, we got to be able to actually measure it. And then second of all, we got to be able to actually design technological interventions that measurably increase the parameters we're trying to change. And so there's a deep design function in here that can only happen with the instrumentation, with the data, and that's what makes this, people are not used to thinking about peace from an engineering perspective. That's what makes this unique and fun and exciting. That's what also, if you look at the more recent history of engineering over the last 500 years, sort of, especially from the Industrial Revolution forward, we've got this notion of having to actually build things that have never existed before that have to work. And the engineering job is not done until they actually work. And you can measure that they work, you know, the airplane flies, the bridge holds up, the building stands up, and so on, you know, so
Right. And I think certainly now, especially with the global conversation around institutional racism, institutional injustice, how can we take in an engineering approach and combine the engineering with the behavioral psychology, because we're very interested in the behavior that people do. So what are the behaviors of justice? And as we build mediating technologies, especially because the world organizes itself around work. You know, as human beings, a lot of the contact that we have with other people is through work. And because we're all using technologies to manage our work, to coordinate, to cooperate, to communicate, to be aware of each other, how might we design those technologies so the default setting is that we are just to each other. The default setting that we are fair to each other, right? That it actually moves us intentionally in that direction. Just as if I buy a power tool, if I buy a power saw, it is designed by default to be safe because it has that mechanism so that I don't cut myself, right? How do we design these social systems toward justice, toward fairness?
And at the same time, how do we do that without weakening the inbuilt social muscles that we have and fairness muscles that we have?
So Mark, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I do want to pick it up with you again. I'm glad that we had an opportunity to talk about engineering and what we think the future of engineering can be through peace engineering, and also beginning to touch on other topics like justice and how do we address justice and fairness from an engineering perspective. And I would love to follow up and talk to you some more about that.